Welcome back. You're watching the Power Breakfast Show, and it's time for our interview this morning. And we'll talk about the gender rule. Yesterday, there was a conference that sought to come up with a formula to ensure that the two-thirds gender rule is met. And to help us understand and to steer this conversation in studio, I'm joined by Marilyn Kamau. She's a lawyer and a member of Thuluthi Mbili, a multi-sectoral stakeholder forum advocating for realization of the gender principle. Now, you want to be part of this conversation? 22422 is the SMS line, or you can get us on Twitter. Our handle is Activism TV Kenya. The hashtag is Power Breakfast. We'd love to hear from you, so get in touch. Miss Marilyn, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
And the first question is, explain to us this new proposal or this new formula that you came up with yesterday that seeks to end, this whole conversation that's been going on the gender rule.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. It's actually not a new formula. The formula has been in place for a while.
Okay.
It's the formula that's proposed by the Technical Working Group,
okay,
which is an intergovernmental task force that was set up by the Attorney General after he went to the Supreme Court in 2012.
Okay.
So after the Supreme Court advisory opinion, the Attorney General received a ruling that said that the two-thirds gender principle was not applicable to the 2013 general election.
Okay.
So the court said it's not applicable to the 2013 general election. However, you are required to implement legislative measures before or by August 27th, 2015. So it should be applicable thereafter. So in response to that, the Attorney General set up this technical working group with membership from the National Gender and Equality Commission, IEBC, CIC, the Attorney General's Office, I said Ministry of Devolution and Planning, I hope. Okay. And various other stakeholders. So it was really an intergovernmental group with representation of the civil society through the International Federation of Women Lawyers, FIDA Kenya.
Okay.
And their preferred viable formula, their recommendation to the Attorney General was to lift Article 177 of the Constitution, which applies to county assemblies, to Article 97 and 98, which apply to the National Assembly and the Senate, respectively.
Okay.
So that's the recommendation, and as I said, it's not new in the sense that it's been here for a while.
Yes.
Yes.
What exactly does it state?
It provides, the technical working group looked at various formulas. So actually, even in the report that they gave to the Attorney General, there were various formula that they listed. But what they had to do was eventually say, okay, so which would we recommend? And they chose to recommend a formula that exists in the current Constitution.
Okay.
So Article 177 applies to county assemblies, and it states, Article 177B, states that should Kenyans not elect a sufficient number of either gender into the county assemblies, so that the county assemblies, based on the elected numbers of MCAs, were more than two-thirds of any gender, whether male or female, then the other gender shall be nominated to ensure that the not more than two-thirds principle is met.
Okay.
And what we and the technical working group found was this was the best formula because it allowed Kenyans to choose. Because Kenyans can elect the numbers, so that the cost of implementation additional cost would be zero.
Yes.
Because if there are sufficient numbers, then there's no nomination required.
Okay.
Or if you don't elect them, then you have to nominate what's called really through proportional representation based on the strength of the various parties.
Okay.
And then the political parties internally would need to come up with their own mechanisms for identifying the people who would be selected.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, there's a bid to see more women participate in politics, actively battle for their seats. But if we go back to our last general election, we had 19 women who vied for governor's seat. None of them made it. None of them made it to the Senate as well. And it comes out like maybe we're not ready to embrace women leadership, especially in politics.
Well, I think one of the things we often do in Kenya about this is we make it seem like it's a national problem, like it's a uniquely Kenyan problem. It's not. This is a global problem. It's a challenge that women have all over the world. And the reason that affirmative action is something that is required is because in order to rectify what has been centuries of exclusion and marginalization of women, affirmative action has been seen as one of the easiest ways to try and increase the numbers of women elected. It's true that we didn't elect as many women, but there's a study from IEBC that shows that actually, in terms of the proportion, it was almost equal proportion of men and women elected. So on average, there were about 10,000 candidates, 11,000 total that ran. 10,000 of them were men, 1,000 were women. So when you look at those numbers, it would have been impossible to elect that many women. So one of the issues we have is really creating an atmosphere within the political environment, both within political parties, but as well as nationally, that women choose to vie for political office. I think some of the things that we're seeing, the treatment of women leaders, I mean, we recently just saw the grilling of the Cabinet Secretary for Devolution and Planning. There's an atmosphere, a hostility to women's leadership that is keeping a lot of credible, good women out of politics.
There's something you said, it being a global problem, but then there are those who argue, look at Rwanda, look at Tanzania, you know, why is it such a big problem in Kenya? And I guess my next question would be, does civic education have a role, you know, to ensure that more people then are aware of the need to have women in politics? And I think even before you answer that question, the other question would be, why do we need the women in politics?
Well, let me start with the last question first. And we don't need the women in politics, we need everybody in politics. We need men, women, we need youth, we need marginalized communities, we need ethnic minorities. Our new constitution really was about inclusion. One of the pillars of this constitution is equality. It's sharing of resources and of power. And when we're talking about the gender principle, we're talking about the sharing of power. With devolution, we're talking about sharing of resources. So this is actually part of just the very same strand that runs through the Constitution. So we're talking about women today, but in actual fact, this principle is really the same one that is ensuring that youth will be would be allowed to participate, that marginalized groups would also be represented in political office. You spoke about other countries in the East Africa community, and I'm glad you brought that up, because actually Kenya is last in EAC in terms of political representation in legislature for women, and that's despite the fact that we have the largest GDP, and we're essentially the wealthiest country in the region, and all the other countries have been able to do this through affirmative action. So what we're really saying is it's not that the trends globally are different from what we're trying to do as Kenyans. It's that we are resisting what is inevitable.
Okay.
This is going to happen.
It has to happen.
It has to happen.
It has to happen. How will we then ensure that this agenda remains pure and does not get eaten up by political parties? Pure in the sense that you're saying, you know, you're calling for better representation of women, youth, marginalized people, people with special, you know, disabilities. So how are you going to ensure that this is going to remain pure and not get tangled up into, you know, the political party scenario?
Well, that's difficult to do because we are our politics. I think sometimes as Kenyans we like to say, well, we're different from those people. But we elect our own. They don't come from anywhere else. They come from our communities. So this provision of the Constitution is going to be enacted the way we choose to enact it as Kenyans. And I say that we are a very privileged generation because unlike those who came before us, I mean, we just did the anniversary of Saba Saba the other day, our job was not to secure this Constitution. Our job is just to protect it. It is a singularly easier task than the task that those before us had. And so what we can choose to do as Kenyans is we can choose a different kind of politics, one that's around inclusion of people and inclusion of different voices, and tolerance. And so I hope that what we're going to do with the two-thirds gender principle is not just talk about gender, but talk about we need a different political space, one in which more people are involved, but one in which more Kenyan citizens feel a stake in this. And if we're excluding half the population, that's not possible. Okay.
And major opponents of this principle say it will be very costly to implement it. You know, there are certain reports reading through saying that those who are against it are saying this is going to be very expensive. I'd like to know what your take is on this.
Yeah, I find this one of the most interesting arguments for two reasons. This is a constitutional principle. It's not even ordinary legislation. The not more than two-thirds gender principle in elective office is found in Article 81 of the Constitution, which provides for the principles of the electoral system. And in that article, you will find universal suffrage, free and fair elections, and the not more than two-thirds principle. So it's a core element of our electoral system, in which case, it would be like saying that, it's too expensive for every Kenyan to have a vote. No one would dream of saying that because it's a constitutional principle. Similarly, why is it when we're speaking about women that suddenly we decide it's too expensive? We could say it's cheaper if we decided, Nyumba Kumi type, all 10 of you get together and you have one vote. It might be cheaper for us as a nation. But what the Constitution was, it was our attempt as Kenyans to say, this is how we want to manage our affairs. And this is what we voted in. And so, by definition, it can't be too expensive. I like to give the example of devolution. Obviously, it's not like we had money sitting somewhere for devolution, but it was a constitutional requirement that we devolve. And because it was a constitutional requirement, we did it. And it's the same way we need to treat the gender principle. It's no different at all. But that being said, the Institute of Economic Affairs conducted a study, the only study that's been conducted so far, and it shows that this principle is affordable. I mean, it's essentially the cost of a loaf of bread for every Kenyan, 58 shillings per year for every Kenyan for full implementation of the gender principle. They compared it to the SGR, which is a major development project. It's less than 5 kilometers of SGR. This is money that we can find and we can afford. What we lack in Kenya, it's not a legal requirement for the two-thirds gender principle. There's no good economic reason not to. What we lack is political will.
Political will, you bring that up. What do you mean by that when you say we lack political will?
I mean that from a legal standpoint, the Constitution is clear about the requirements. We have 2 court rulings, not one from the Supreme Court of Kenya and one from the High Court, both of them requiring the executive and the legislature to implement legislation. And we have the Jubilee Manifesto, the manifesto of the ruling coalition, which explicitly states that they're going to fully implement the Constitution and what they called the 1/3 rule. So in actual fact, all the utterances are correct, but their actions are not aligned with the utterances. And what we need right now is we need clear direction from the President on how he's going to direct the Attorney General to comply with this provision. It's, the last court ruling we got was on the 26th of June. That was from Justice Mumbi, and that was clear. It gave the Attorney General and CIC 40 days to consult and table a bill before Parliament to realize the two-thirds gender principle. We're almost 20 days into that. A bill is already ready. The recommendations of the technical working group are there. It's inexplicable why we continue to have these delays.
Well, we need to keep going back and forth. All right, I'll read an SMS here. What about recommending that political parties are made to present 50% persons of either gender for elected posts?
I think that's brilliant. And there are lots of very good recommendations out there. And what we're saying is, let's continue to look at how we can do this as well as we can. But what is critical is that there's a constitutional deadline, which is August 27th, 2015, which is just a couple of months away. And that deadline is paramount. If we create an environment where we can willfully violate deadlines and articles of the Constitution, then we're really creating a very just treacherous path. And it's less than 5 years since we implemented this Constitution. So we're happy to look at ordinary legislation that looks at really making political parties a better and a bigger part of having more women vie. But the bigger issue is making sure that we meet this constitutional deadline.
We're pushing for this, and I'll go back to the question of civic education. Do you think it is important for it to take place so that as much as we've pushed for this,
yes,
it comes into reality?
I think it's critical. You're right about that, and I think I missed it the last time you asked me. Civic education is an important part, but I also remind people, it's less than 5 years since we passed the Constitution. There was a lot of civic education done around the Constitution. So really what we're doing is we're reminding people of many of the things that some of them already know. Secondly, I know the Ministry of Devolution and Planning and the National Gender and Equality Commission are going to roll out a large civic education program around election of male and female leaders and diversity in leadership. So that's going to be an important component as well. At the Lusimbili, one of the things we've done is we have been we've rolled out a campaign that's national where we're collecting signatures to really pressure the government to comply in a timely manner with this provision. But part of what we're doing when we're doing that is educating citizens about the importance of electing diverse leaders. And inclusion as a principle, whether it's persons with disabilities or women, and also asking women to run. As I told you, in the last election, one of the challenges is there's not enough women running. So that civic education is a core component, and I hope that even radio talk shows like this are helping us get that message out.
Okay, you said something, and we've talked about it. Women not running, but then there's also that argument that we elected women representatives, and some are working. Majority feel they don't work, so they ask why bother. Why bother having them and they're not doing anything for us?
Well, let's start with some important statistics. The National Assembly is about 19% female. So I always find this a very interesting question, because it's like going to a classroom and talking about the two people who in that class are doing a particular way and ignoring the majority. So let's be very clear. The women are no different from the men, in my view. When I advocate for greater inclusion of women in leadership, I'm not saying we're going to be better leaders. I'm just saying we have a different voice, and our voice is also important. So the women have done an enormous amount. They've done the things that you're supposed to do in the national legislature. Oversight. They have helped in terms of legislation. One of the things that I love to point to is the Public Procurement and Disposal Bill. There was a Sakaja amendment which came before the new Public Procurement and Disposal Bill, and that was enshrining the 30% public procurement in law. And that included women, persons with disabilities, and the youth. And that was, we couldn't have gotten that through without KEWAPA, the Kenya Women Parliamentary Association, and of course Honorable Sakaja. But there are many instances of those types of relationships where women are aligning with other interests in the House to make sure that good legislation is passed. And then the other thing that's not so well publicized is the legislation that never gets to the floor because women have quietly lobbied or prevailed upon their colleagues that this is not a good course of action. So when we judge the effectiveness of our legislatures, there are the things that are seen and the things that are unseen. And one of the things we can definitely say is we're definitely seeing less gender-biased legislation than we saw before. Okay. And that's a function of having more women.
Yeah, it's a sign that they're actually working.
They're working, yes.
A lot of SMSs are coming in, and most people are of the views, sadly men, that and I'm just putting it in general, why are women fighting for freebies? I think you need to explain. Everyone is asking, why are women fighting for this freebies? Why don't they want to actually fight for it? And I think we also need to be very clear as to what exactly is going on, because I feel many people think that this is just being given out.
Yes, yes. Well, first of all, it's not a freebie. Women voted for the Constitution, so this is one of the things that we could argue we gave ourselves, right? Just like men voted for certain parts of the Constitution, this was something we gave ourselves as part of the population of Kenya. Affirmative action is a principle that's in Article 27, 6 and 8 of the Constitution. It's not something that's outside of the Constitution. And what I keep reminding people is the Constitution is part of this tapestry that weaves us together as a nation. And if we each start pulling a thread, saying this clause I don't like this clause, pretty soon there's nothing left. So we agreed on this. This is not pre-constitutional time. We're not negotiating. The Constitution was passed. We're talking about implementation. And the one thing that I do think that they have a very strong point on is, can we create a more competitive process in terms of how women are getting in? And what a lot of women have said is, well, the political parties are extremely hostile. So if we can create a more amenable environment within the political parties, more women will vie for the main seats, and more women will get elected. And so some of the amendments that that we are proposing to the Political Parties and the Elections Act are directed towards creating that political party environment that's more hospitable towards women. But let's be clear, these are not freebies. This is a constitutional requirement, one, and number two, women are still vying. Even when the seats are nominated, it's what's called the proportional representation system, which is also a form of representation. And it looks at the political party, and then it's up to the political party to say, for instance, well, you know what, Kirigo has been extremely active in supporting our political party. Maybe not on the front side, but she's been very active in helping us draft policy, in doing all of these things. So we'll nominate her because we think that she will add strength to us in in the house when she goes in. It's a woman who perhaps has been a great mobilizer. So even when women are nominated, and it's true we do need to tighten some of those rules, they bring something to the table. It's just sometimes it's not the straight, you know, battle it out on the floor or fight it out in the street skill.
Yeah. All right. Eric Intika says, let's do this progressively. Push government with appointments first as we do civic education. Elections are people's choices. Can't force people through laws.
Eric is wrong. And really that's just and we need to start being very clear about this. The Constitution is not optional. In fact, the oath that the President takes is that he will uphold and protect the Constitution. And it's also our job as citizens to uphold and protect this document. So the fact that we don't like this particular provision, what if I don't like the one on property rights? You know, what if I don't like another provision that protects your rights? This is what binds us as a nation. We don't have to like every part of the Constitution, but we certainly have to comply, because once we choose the path of non-compliance, what we're really saying is then we get to pick and choose which laws we abide by and which we don't. And that's really the path to anarchy. Yeah.
Moses in Westland says, clearly, the Kenyan women voters are more than the men. If they don't elect their own, why force it constitutionally? The gender principle causing unnecessary money wastage. I think what we also need to clear is the gender rule is not purely for women.
Exactly. Yes.
It is not purely for women.
Yes.
Like you said, it is for the youth, the women, people with special abilities, disabilities, and marginalized communities, right? I think it's important.
Well, the gender rule itself is explicit on gender, but Article 100 is the one that provides that there's a requirement that there's legislation for all those groups.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
The Speaker of the National Assembly stated that women representative positions and nominated seats should be removed, and in their place 100 women be nominated. I'd like to hear your take on that.
Well, thankfully you don't really have to, because the Speaker withdrew that. And we had lots of meetings with the Speaker. We've had meetings with the Attorney General and with KEWOPA, including with the National Gender and Equality Commission, as just interested stakeholders. And when we took the Speaker through why we were proposing the technical working group formula and then the additional amendments to the Political Parties and the Elections Act, he withdrew his proposal. But my feeling is that we can change our system if we want to, but let's change it after we've complied with the Constitution. I like to use the analogy, parents will understand this. You take your child to the doctor, you're given a dose of antibiotics, and you're told, you know, take this for 5 or 7 days. But it doesn't matter if you're feeling better after day 1, you must complete the full course. And you have to complete the full course, because if not, then you will develop resistance to the medicine, but also as a society will suffer because there'll be resistant strains of bacteria that will make it more expensive for all of us. Similarly, should we choose not to implement this provision, we might think that it's just women who will suffer, but what we'll be creating is a standard that some parts of the law, when they choose whoever is in office at the time, will not be implemented. And down the line, that's going to affect every citizen of the Republic of Kenya. So we really need to look at this document, the Constitution, as our collective security. So sometimes it's in your favor, Kirigo, sometimes it's in mine, sometimes it's in someone else's favor, but what we need to trust and believe in is that at all points, it will always be in one of our favors.
Okay. Someone else asks, what happens if you don't beat the August 27th deadline?
And actually that's becoming a very clear possibility. Sadly, the Constitution provides that if you don't meet the deadline in Article 261(5), any citizen can move to court and seek dissolution of Parliament. I had hoped personally that we were going to have the Attorney General, after we got the ruling from Justice Mombi's court, table the technical working group formula and have a bill in Parliament by now. It's looking like the delays are many for varied reasons, many of them really not explicable. And so that's what we face, which is a constitutional crisis, because at that point the citizen would move to, and it's any citizen, they would move to court, they would seek dissolution of Parliament. It would be our hope that the court would look very carefully at the history that the executive has had in terms of implementing court rulings. But I also think that it's from a government standpoint, it's a bad precedent, because we could go to court, we could get another order from a citizen goes to court, they get an order dissolving parliament, but we'll be in exactly the same position we are in today. We'd be asking the executive to order the dissolution of parliament. So I actually think one of the other things that we have to take very seriously is that we are looking at an executive that is failing to adhere to the principles of constitutionalism by failing to obey court orders. And what does that mean? If the executive decides that it is exempt from obeying court orders, then we would seek to dissolve parliament, and if there's an order given, then what if they don't comply? We're creating unnecessary constitutional crisis, in my view.
So, Marilyn, from where you're standing, how then should we move on, seeing as we only have 20 days or so?
Yes.
Or actually, it's actually a month, about a month and 2 weeks. What should we do?
Well, first, we really need to hear from the president. I think the president has been extremely quiet on this issue while making very many other pronouncements on gender. This is the biggest, most significant gender issue of his administration. The Jubilee Manifesto is clear. The Constitution is clear. We have 2 court orders. We really need to hear what the direction is from the head of state. Secondly, that direction should be provided to the Attorney General. The Attorney General is not an independent actor. He acts for the executive. So we would want the president to direct the Attorney General to table the technical working group bill, and to do that hopefully within the next 7 days or so. Once that bill is tabled, because it's a constitutional amendment bill, it requires 90 days between the first and the second reading. While we would still miss the August 27th deadline, it would be the required good faith to show us that we are on track to implement this important provision. So I don't feel like there's anything that's going to happen until we hear from President Kenyatta. I really think that there's nothing else that can move us. We need serious political will. We need the head of state to back Kenyan women, and the Constitution of Kenya, as he swore to do.
Okay. I'll read an SMS from Muthoni Kamau. She says, studies have shown that in the worst case scenario, which would be to increase the numbers in Parliament, it will cost every taxpayer just about 58 shillings per year or 4 shillings per month. Surely the cost of a sweet. Why does it become costly to implement the Constitution where it is women affected? Are women not major taxpayers, given all the farming and small trading that they do, plus all the unpaid care work they do? That's Muthoni Kamau asking a very valid question.
Yes.
Very, very valid. Political parties should be allowed to nominate a number of women according to their strength in Parliament. This is Hillary in Nairobi. Deal with the fundamental issue of why Kenyans prefer men to women. That's the call. What's the cost estimate based on? Because if the citizens elect the requisite numbers, then the cost will be zero unless there's an assumption that only nominations is the only way. This is Kamau in Embakasi. What do you have to say for that?
Well, and that's what I was saying when I was talking about the IEBC findings. What IEBC found was when we had about 1,000 women running and 10,000 men running, the women were elected at about 14% proportionally into seats, and this is everything from president to MCA, and the men at 15%. That discrepancy is 1 percentage point. It means that actually the discrimination is not happening at the citizen level. What we're talking about is the discrimination is happening at the political party. Fewer women are actually getting nominated or actually receiving tickets in strongholds, in party strongholds. The women are choosing themselves not to run, again, because of this atmosphere, this hostility we're creating to women's leadership. So we're not looking at it's not a citizen problem. Citizens are electing women. We need more women to run, so that if we had, it means that if we had about 6,000 women and 6,000 men, we would have elected significantly more women. So I think if many of these opponents would put their efforts towards identifying who are the women around them that they think are qualified and are credible, and asking those women to run, and making the environment safe for those women to run, then we really wouldn't be having to have this discussion.
Yes, yes.
But at the end of the day, this is a futile struggle. Women will get into political office. We will get affirmative action legislation.
We have to.
We have to.
But someone says, find a good law that is acceptable to all but don't just focus on elections, rather politics alone. With less than 2,000 positions, appointments in civil service, private sector has more than 50,000 positions. This is Eric. He says those are my 2 cents. I don't know what you think about that.
Yes, the principle, the 2/3 principle applies to both elective office and appointive office.
Okay.
However, the constitutional crisis is from the elective body.
Yes.
We're still having a little trouble with meeting the appointive, but the Jubilee government has actually been extremely good at appointive offices from cabinet. We saw that in the parastatal appointments, even though they had other issues. So in terms of appointive, we're doing better. We're not exactly there, but we're doing significantly better. The crisis is really around Article 81B on elective bodies at the national level. Yes.
And moving away from matters politics, what about the private sector?
You know, actually, I was speaking to somebody at the World Bank earlier this week, and I said, in many ways, our government, our public sector is leading the private sector. We're seeing significantly more positive gender policy from the public sector. They're having trouble implementing,
yes,
but they're trying a lot harder than the private sector. We're not seeing as much in the private sector. For instance, the public procurement provision, I was talking to you about the 30% public procurement provision, where 30% of all government contracts are reserved for women, youth, and persons with disabilities. We haven't really seen the private sector take that up, although the public sector has already created a mechanism for identifying these companies. So it would be very easy for the private sector to then say, okay, since the government's already identified you, we're going to give you additional business so that we can actually spur economic growth. So our private sector, I think, has a lot more to do, and maybe what they can help with is they can help by implementing better, because certainly the government is doing very well on policy. Yes.
The fact that it is a constitutional principle does not mean as a country we implement it without due consideration of its implication to the general well-being of the country. The big question is why women don't elect other women into power.
You know what, we keep stating that it's not true and it's not factual. So I think one of our problems with this discussion has been that there's a constant rerun. There's a narrative of women don't elect other women, women are not doing anything. None of this is borne out by any studies or any facts. As you saw, as I said, you know, the citizens are electing women, and some of those citizens are women. So we are electing women, we just need more numbers.
Yeah.
From a legal standpoint, I think it's all these sort of, in America they're called couch potato lawyers. That's not the legal position. A constitutional provision is a constitutional provision. And by definition, it is reasonable because it is constitutional.
Constitutional.
Yes.
All right, Miss Mary-Lane Kamuru, sorry. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. That was a very interesting conversation, and we can only wish you the best. Hopefully you'll beat the August 27th deadline. With the President Act, I'm sure we can. We hope so. We hope he's heard, and we hope he'll do something. So thank you so much for coming this morning on the Power Breakfast Show. You're watching the Power Breakfast Show. Don't go too far.